Okay, welcome to Tech Tuesday number 41. Today we're going to talk about IP, learning, and gaps. And that's why this smiley has a gap between their teeth. And if this smiley would try to whistle, it wouldn't come out. And the same way, if you have IP with a gap in it, you're going to have problems. So sadly, we're going to take a moment of silence because hostages are not back yet. Let's hope by next time. So what am I talking about? IP is a learning experience, or I should say maybe reflects a learning experience. And the questions that we need to think about is who learns, what do they learn, when do they learn it, and when should they learn it? And surprisingly, is there any downsides to people learning things? And what I'm going to try to prescribe is maybe what you should be learning, and of course, most important, how to avoid these downsides. So if I really had to explain what do I mean by learning, so if you have a company and it's developing some new product, that company is going to learn things, and I'll say what in a minute, and then they file IP. And the IP that a company files is, and I'm going to focus on what's a company bypassed, but of course, and where the company might be going. On the other hand, IP and the process of getting IP and other people's IP teaches you. And if the company is clever, it responds to what it learns from IP and it does things differently. So learning and IP are always bouncing off each other. And let me start with a simple example. I took two cool new products, and the first one is a Californian startup that can make butter directly from gases, from carbon dioxide and hydrogen. And hydrogen is also in the atmosphere. So basically, you have a box, and instead of my wife saying, Mayor, go buy butter, I press a button, and 20 minutes later, she has a tub full of butter. Okay? It's wonderful. But butter is not just a fat. Okay? Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to make ghee. Butter is more than just fat. And here's another very cool machine. It's called the S1 by Igulu, and it's a home beer brewing machine. Basically, you put in the powder, you put in the food, you put in the water, you wave an RFID over it, and it knows exactly how to make your beer. And then you press a button, and within 1 or 2 weeks, your beer is going to be ready. I think that's a great product, just one problem. What are you going to drink while you're waiting? So what we see here is a gap between, let's call it the proof of concept, and the actual product. And as you know, gaps are exactly where we're going to be filing IP. So I did a nice triangle here, and we have the problem being solved. For example, that we can't make the beer that we want. the solution, which is a S1 device, and the product vision, which is probably a little bit more sophisticated than the S1 device. And one of the examples that I want to give you is the iPhone version 1. If anybody remembers it, it didn't have GPS. It couldn't record video. I don't think there's anybody who thought that the iPhone 2 or 3 or 4 also wouldn't have GPS or have video. Everybody knew these features were coming. So the product vision clearly included video recording. The actual product didn't. Now, these gaps between the actual problem that needs to be solved, your solution, which might not solve all of the problem or might solve a different problem, and the product vision, which might or might not solve the problem and might or might not be the same as the solution, are what I call gaps. And when I say a gap, I don't mean a place that we're going to expand to. The gap exists already now. Right now, in other words, when Steve Jobs launched the iPhone 1, the idea that we would use it for scanning objects in 3D, that wasn't part of the product vision. Okay, that's a future direction. But the idea that we'd be able to record video and send it to other people, that was part of the product vision. It just wasn't part of the actual solution. So a gap is something that we know about and maybe everybody knows about. And wherever you have a gap, there's two things you can expect to happen. One, it's a good place to have IP. And two, if the company's going to do what I call a mini pivot, not completely changing the product, but making a significant change in what the product does, that's where it's going to happen. Maybe you'll realize that your solution doesn't exactly solve the problem. Maybe you'll realize that your product vision is not exactly correct. But the minute you have a mismatch and a gap, that's where things can happen. So what causes these gaps? Obviously, it can happen because of limited imagination. That's why I brought you the iPhone 1. Nobody suspects Steve Jobs of having had a limited imagination. It can be caused by the MVP attitude. People confuse a minimum viable product with an actual first product. It could be cost. It could be tech integration problems. That's why I think the GPS wasn't there. And it can be trying. Maybe we can get away with it. So let's try to get away with it. But I think the biggest reason for gaps is what's called first mover advantage. It is a belief that if you're the first one in the market with a product, you will be able to take over that product. Or it'll be much easier for you to take over that market. Whichever, it means that people come out with products where they don't exactly solve the problem and definitely don't match the product vision. Now, I'm bringing a quote here from Andy Machuk. He writes about why books don't really work. We don't have to agree with him about that, so he's pretty convincing. He's talking about education using books, and he has a quote which I edited. Shaped intentionally or not, each invention's fundamental materials and constraints give it a grain which makes it bend naturally in some directions and not in others. Okay, and what I'm saying is that the very act of invention will already cause you to go in certain directions, which, as you'll see, creates gaps. Now, I talked about gaps in a previous talk, number 21, but there's the gaps had to do with exploring the invention, not with learning. And the basic premise in the current presentation is that if you do one thing, it means you're not doing other things, and that the learning that you do gives you exactly this grain. And I'll give you two very common examples. Example number one, they have many clients, medical devices, and they make a medical device and they ignore that the same device could be used for wellness application. Now, it doesn't matter if they're right or not, but it's definitely a gap between what they're doing and what they could be doing. Another example, 120 years ago, people had electric cars, and then they disappeared, and everybody worked on improving gasoline engines. And then suddenly, electric cars came back. So these electric cars were being ignored. That was a very big gap. And in fact, a whole new car company was able to come into existence, Tesla, just because everybody was ignoring that part of the market which everybody knew could exist. They just maybe didn't think it was viable. Concept related to gaps is debt. I think a very familiar concept to people, especially in software, is technical debt. It means instead of writing the software the way you should, you just mess around and it starts working, you debug it. And obviously, when you do that, later on, it's going to catch up with you. Now, that's definitely a problem for R&D and it will affect the products. But from an IP perspective, it interferes with the company exploring the alternatives. And it can definitely interfere with you identifying new IP because all of the clever people are busy solving the technical debt instead of inventing new stuff. So that's technical debt, and it's a common term. A less common term is innovation debt. Innovation debt is when you don't invent something because you're too busy innovating. Now, innovating is getting the product to the market, all the way from the idea until the market. Once you have something that works, often you stop inventing, and you're too busy making it marketable. Stopped inventing, perhaps also not filing IP or not identifying IP. Intellectual debt is another kind of debt, and it's also caused by moving fast. And intellectual debt is when you have something that works, but you have no idea why it works. And what it means is if you filed a patent on what you're doing, it could very well be that you're not protected because there's way better ways of doing it, but you have no idea. And it also can interfere with further development processes, but that's not our business. In any case, in a startup company, especially one that wants to be a first mover, this makes a lot of sense. If we're going to be first, we're willing to take a loan, a technical debt. We're willing to have innovation debt, willing to have intellectual debt, as long as we're first and we start capturing the market. But guess what? I'm an IP person. And what we're talking about today is how this behavior causes problems with the IP. So the way I would even present it is that innovation is in conflict with IP. So obviously, if somebody invents something, then we can file a patent for it. But when you put a lot of energy into innovating, then you usually avoid creating IP. I mean, you might create know-how and trade secrets, but you probably won't collect them. And if somebody comes up with a new idea, you're not going to test it out because you have to get your product out the door. In general, new ideas have risk. Now, some companies are not like that, but I think most companies...
Can I comment?
No, at the end. But most companies do not like new ideas while they're working. And one more problem with innovation, if your competitor innovates, he can expose a gap in your protection. So innovation is bad for IP in other ways as well. This book was a very cool book once, and I have not only this book, but another book which is a response to it. And what the book talks about is the fact that companies, in order to succeed, have to be learning organizations. So you don't only have product market fit, you also have product company fits, meaning the company evolves and makes itself more adapted to what's needed. So what does a company learn while it's doing this innovation and adaptation process? One, skills. Get people who know how to do certain things. You get knowledge and data. You get new ways of thinking. You learn mistakes and how to avoid them. You learn what the norms are. And remember, especially in startup companies, it could be that nobody else knows any of this. You learn, you get insights, you get inspiration. The market, the technology, the competition, the ecosystem, these are all things that you're going to learn as you go on your innovation journey. You learn fear, okay? Meaning some things can kill the company, you learn to be scared of them. You get a certain mindset in how you deal with what's happening here. So not invented here, or been there, done that, I'm not going to try it again, are things that the company learns. And I'm giving here a convenient quote by Arthur C. Clarke, which says that if one of these experts says you can do it, he's probably right. If he says it's impossible, he's probably wrong. So these are all things that you learn, and you have to learn in order to succeed. And they, of course, interfere with IP, or partly interfere with IP. There's also past propensity, and I'm going to talk about it later, which has to do how likely you are to go in one direction or in another. And that is also something that you learn, but it's unintentional. So maybe to recap, traditionally learning is considered to be good. It's definitely critical in order to help you adapt to the world. But learning makes your company an expert. And experts, as any one of you knows, means that you have a narrower mindset and the range of behaviors that you typically apply go down. So how is learning good for IP? Well, if we learned all of these things that we had in the previous slide, we can predict what's going to happen. And we can file patents. We can definitely predict where the company is going, because the company is going to have difficulty going where it doesn't have skills. If we have an insight or if we understand the market, we can write incredible IP. But the company is learning what's good for itself. And I remind you that IP is about the competition or potential partners, let's call them. So the more you learn and the more you become an expert in your way of doing things, and the more you go in the direction which you believe is right, the more likely you are to create gaps where somebody can fit in. You must be asking, well, what should we be doing about this? And I'm asking the same question, and I have a few answers. First question is, basic one, are you able to figure out where you're going, where you're naturally going, and where you're not naturally going? It also means that since you agree that you're going to create new gaps, you need to find the gaps or find some other solution. I called it blanket protection, to prevent these gaps from being taken advantage of by competition. One of the things you can definitely do is a company tries out different ideas and drops them for whatever reason, and the reason doesn't matter. But you definitely want to know what they are, and you definitely want to mine them for insights into alternative possibilities. And like we do when we write a patent application and the client tells us you have an A and a B and they're connected using a C, and you say, okay, did you have any other embodiments? And he said, yeah, maybe they can be connected using a D, but it doesn't work very well. So we're going to put that as a patent application, usually, not always, but it's definitely a direction that has to be identified. So if we have all of these gaps, one of the questions we have to ask, is this gap obvious to the competition? We're worried about somebody taking advantage of us. That's the only reason we're talking about gaps. So one possibility is to fill in the gap, less common. Another one is to block a gap using IP. Also, trade secrets can be used to block a gap. If you're the only one who knows how to do something, the fact that you're not doing it doesn't help other people. You can hide gaps. And remember, trade secrets can also be the very fact that there's an alternative solution. And one of the things that some companies do are trying to outrun gaps. By the time my competition discovers this gap, I'm going to be 2 steps ahead. And by the time they discover a new gap, I'm going to be another 2 steps ahead. In any case, when we talk about gaps, we have to think about the mindset, not of us, but of the competition and the customers and other players, and also take into account that this mindset is going to change. So the good news is that IP is usually about parts of a solution, not a complete solution. So if there's a gap, and often the gap is there because we don't know how to solve what's in the gap, we can still get IP to block what's happening in the gap. Let's imagine we have a machine and we have a spring which pushes 2 parts apart. And it could be done possibly using gas pressure instead of a spring, but we have no idea how. We can still get IP, or we have no idea how to do it in a way which is viable. We can still get IP on using the gas, even though we don't have a complete solution. Okay? So, but you have to give attention to it. Dealing with gaps is a function of whoever's doing IP strategy. So basically it's reflective thinking. What will I learn? What will I do with what I learn? What did I learn? Where am I going? Okay? And that is a strategic function. Usually people can't do it on the day-to-day. For sure, IP strategy group, let's call it, should be looking at these debts that I mentioned before and the gaps and see how they're developing. Why? Because it's an IP risk, meaning a risk of the IP losing effectiveness or of the IP not being able to provide what the company needs. Filling the gaps with IP is a pure IP task. We're just going to file a patent. It could be that AI can help because AI has fewer preconceptions if you ask it a question correctly. Sometimes you don't use IP in order to solve a gap, but if we think of something like an innovation debt, meaning we're still using Windows 95 in our system because we didn't upgrade because we're too busy improving our rocket engine, true story. Easiest thing to do is not to develop a new spaceship, but to file IP on how our spaceship would look different with Windows 11 or 12 or whatever it might be. So I'm suggesting that the company, or at least the IP management department, should have a unit that is dedicated to learning about the others, competitors and so on. So if you track where the competitors are and where they might be going, you can better understand gaps, and you can also better understand where to block them. So it's a 2-for-1. Not only are we using this separate unit for gap detection and blocking, we're also using it in general to attack the competition. And one of the problems we have is that while you should have a separate compartment thinking about IP and others, what we're talking about is not really in line with the company main goal, which is, bringing widget blue to the market. And that means that when you have crunch time, the people whose job it is to do this strategic thinking might be preempted to do what's needed today for the good of the company. So that has to be, planned in. Here's a concept which might help us use what we learned in order to identify gaps and fill them in. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with a keel, but if you have a boat, sailboat, and the sail's on top and the wind pushes here, you have a keel on the bottom. What is that keel good for? Well, if you just think about it, if you have a boat and the wind is blowing, the boat would move sideways. What if you want the boat to move against the wind? You can. It's called tacking. If you look in this picture, the wind is coming from right on top, and the boat keeps on moving at an angle to the wind, but forward towards the wind. How can it do it? When the wind pushes back, here the boat's at number 1. When the wind is pushing back, the keel is preventing the boat from sliding across the surface of the sea. So that's a concept of a keel. And we can take, and I'm giving you an example of, we have an insight or belief, X, whatever X is. What if we're wrong about X? Okay, we're using X as sort of temporary anchor because we believe it. And then we ask, well, what if we're wrong? What IP do we need? And a very common example is when you have a client and they insist, you must do A and you must do B. Well, whenever the client tells you, you must do A, you know that the client will be ignoring any alternative to A because you must do it. But IP people, they can't afford to do that. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Peter Thiel question. He had this idea that he would pay you $100,000 to leave university and open a startup. And one of the questions that he likes that he's a big investor, PayPal and so on. What do you believe that's important that most people don't know or agree with you? Well, obviously, if you know how to answer that question, we're going to write IP based on that. But more important, most people don't believe it. If they don't believe it, maybe they're right, or maybe even they're wrong, but they're going to go in that direction, and that defines gaps that we're not covering because we believe it. In general, if you can identify an insight, you can look at the opposite of the insight. Don't ask me to explain what that means, or a variant of the insight, and ask yourself, well, where does that lead us to? There's a whole field of historical counterfactuals. What if the Nazis had won World War II? Make a TV show out of it, of course, and lots of books. Now, a company usually doesn't care about this question because they're moving in the direction they're moving. But the IP people are thinking about the competition and where the competition might go. So historical counterfactuals are very relevant in IP. Say a little bit more about other people. Other people as competitors, but not only competitors. First, sorry for the typo, they need to want to learn. A lot of competitors, clients, partners, suppliers, they don't want to change what they're doing. So sometimes you have to help them learn. And even when they do, there's people involved, companies and bureaucracies even heavier than people. They tend to change their mind very slowly. What does that mean for us? It means that if you make a bold change, it might not be copied. especially if it seems weird or if the competitor is lacking the infrastructure. Oh, it's a big change, it's too big for us, we'll continue with what we were doing before. And you can look at the iPhone as an example. Very bold change. Samsung decided to copy it, or so the courts have said. But Nokia either didn't or couldn't because it didn't have the proper infrastructure. But once it works, everybody will be copying it. But it also means that if what you're doing is a series of incremental changes, your competitor is much more likely to copy them one at a time, good or bad. We have to assume that the competition comes with their own insights, which is different from yours, and they also have momentum. So if you understand the psychology, for example, if you know that your competitor believes in not invented here, we can help them. And what that leads us to, and I really plug it wherever I can, the issue of deception. What your competitor will actually learn depends not only on how well we teach them or avoid teaching them, but also if we do diversion or deception techniques. Till now, I've kind of talked about the future, but let's talk a little bit about the past. So where we go depends on where we are and what we have. Where we are, what we have is what we've learned until now. But where we are is how we got here. So the path that you start on is a resource, and it's also an anchor because it's difficult for you to move off of it. Kind of like having blinders if you're a horse. So your path is kind of your destiny. It's very difficult for an automobile company to start making telephones. It's not impossible. I mean, if a wood company can start making telephones, so can an automobile, but it's difficult. And two of the things that bother you are insight. If you have an insight, you use it. And where you can't use it, you don't go in that direction. So if you have a big invention and it's a new way of looking at the world, then that's great, and we'll file patents on the consequences and so on. But the skills that you need in order to carry out the invention, the skills you're going to develop, and the company structure, and the partners you have, and the money stream you're going to create, all of them set your path. And maybe it's not true about Kodak, but Kodak is, the poster child. Kodak focused so much on chemical films that even though they invented the digital camera, they weren't able to change. Now that may not be true, but it's a great story, and that's what I'm talking about. You have something else, which is also the enemy, called inspiration. Your leader, your founder, has this vision, and that vision is pulling you in that direction. And anything that's not in the direction of that vision is, not part of your path. It doesn't have to be that way, okay? But as time goes on, it becomes more and more that way. IP can be used to help you a little bit. Most companies are trying to optimize what they're doing and not explore. But if you know where the company is going, what the path is, and the company is, not really going to leave that path, you can still create a strip on either side of that path, which is protected by IP in case the company wants to change what they're doing. So if we have a product which is being sold to private users, we're still going to file IP which covers that product being sold to, let's call it, clinics. Okay, it's not a big change from the past, perhaps, but it's a possible one. Now we have this great definition of intellectual debt, which I just mentioned earlier. And one of the reasons why past is destiny, because once you start in this direction, you're doing what you're doing without understanding what you're doing. So I would recommend breaking the cycle. And at the very least, identify the why or the possible whys, why it works, and cover them with IP and generated alternatives. And I want to point out it's not only with big scientific discoveries, but every time you have some sort of patch, repair, fine tuning of your system, it works. And people don't really understand why this little change made it work better, which is a pity because, IP. I'm giving you now 3 different theories regarding this past propensity. The first one is our friend Innovator's Dilemma. So it's not exactly a past theory, but it does talk about the fact that a company, once it finds its direction, is not willing to change what they're doing. And even though it has a lot to do with sunk cost and cannibalization, and difficulty of changing your mindset from extracting to exploring, there's definitely an issue of institutional learning, which is, what I've been talking about. Second book is by the founder of Square. He calls it the Innovation Stack, and he wrote the book because he said it's strange. Amazon tried to beat us, and they couldn't. Why couldn't Amazon beat us? And I hope I'm summarizing it properly, but basically what it says is the path that you take is what makes you unbeatable. You're the first one to find this problem, and the next problem, and the next problem, and the next problem. And as you identify these problems, you build an innovation stack, which is not only the solution to the problems, but also a company optimized to race along this pathway. I'm saying, very nice, and putting aside the question of whether or not a company like that IP is important or not, a significant portion of the IP should not be on your innovation stack because your competitor can't do it. By definition, that's what we were told. And another theory about paths, again, these theories help understand what they mean, is CK theory, and I have a picture for you here. You have a concept space and a knowledge space. Basically, you have an existing knowledge and it gives you a concept. So you use a concept and develop more knowledge, and it goes back to here. So you have added knowledge from concept exploration, and then you further develop the concept. And what I want you to see is not only the dialogue between concepts and knowledge, but the fact that the different possibilities, but we chose one of them to develop. And this CK theory explains how you get there. I mentioned before the gaps on IP issue. And if you can see the gaps, we can predict some of the future. For example, how will the competitor possibly use the gaps to avoid our IP? How can gaps that we ignore be used against us? The example I give here is capping, which is basically that you forgot to talk about the last step. The competitor gets IP on the last step, and then you're stuck because you need that last step. But in any case, you identified the gaps, and now you need to watch them. Okay, so obviously you're watching the competition, your main path, your suppliers, your customers, your market, but also the gaps. And what are you watching for in these gaps? Is a competitor actually moving in? If you have trade secrets that are supposed to be protecting that gap, are they now becoming obsolete? For example, Maybe some new technology allows these gaps to be bridged. Or the other way around, maybe you can use a new technology to block these gaps using IP. Are these gaps attractive? If they're attractive, people want to come in. Anything the business is doing, can it be helpful for blocking these gaps or for hiding them? Okay, these are all IP strategy functions. And I've talked here as if, you see the gap and you know what's going to happen and so on, but we all know that's not what happens. IP is really a game of telephone, meaning we don't really understand and it keeps on evolving, but also your competition doesn't really understand and is always evolving. And their understanding, let's say your competitor actually wants to copy you. So you say, yeah, I'm going to write a patent on what I'm doing, and my competitor wants to copy me, and he's going to bang his head into what I'm doing. But your competitor doesn't understand what you're doing. They think you're doing something else. They're going off of your path because of their path. And your IP needs to take that into account. And more so, what you're doing is probably a pile of garbage. Why? Because you rush to become first. Your competitor can probably do better than what you're doing, by definition, because they took the time to learn from your mistakes and copy. Last but not least, there's an issue of timing. What does that mean? Learning is a process. It takes time. Implementing what you learned and changing things takes time, both for you and for other people. Your understanding developing well enough to actually find all of these gaps for you or the competition also takes time. And we can perhaps control a little bit by marketing in a positive or negative way. In any case, your IP should plan not only what can happen, but also when do we expect these processes to happen? Okay, when will our product be clear enough to the competition so they'll be able to copy it, and only then do we need a granted patent to block them? Perhaps. At the same time, guess what? Your IP itself, people need to understand it. So the question here is, when will the competition understand that your IP is actually blocking them? It's not trivial when you look at IP to know whether or not it blocks you. Sometimes you don't want them to know. Sometimes you want them to see the IP and decide not to compete with you. Sometimes you worry that they'll understand the IP design around it and compete with you, so you want them not to know that they're infringing until you can suddenly string it out on them. To summarize this relatively long presentation, innovation is a learning process that creates gaps. Learning can be bad for IP. Innovation can be bad for IP. Why? Because the more you learn and the more you do, the more you ignore, by definition. Gaps, unfortunately, are critical for moving fast. So please acknowledge them and protect them using IP. And last but not least, you should practice reflective thinking about your company, where it's going, what's open, and so on. To perhaps show you how it could work in the real world, I want to put a nanny cam on my cat. There's different reasons to do it. One of it is, well, not important. So that's my vision. Now, we already know that version 1 is going to be manually charged. You take the cat and you plug it into a USB. And it only gives you a picture like that. Version 2 is going to somehow, we don't know yet, but give you a picture all around the cat. And version 3 will be self-cleaning and self-charging. Okay, imagine, we know that already. But what you have to ask yourself is, when we race to do this, what kind of gaps might suddenly appear? And how we can use IP to protect these gaps. So I am now stopping the recording.